All right, well today we're going to talk about the central book, or at least the first two chapters of the central book of the Gulag Archipelago. The central book is called The Soul and the Barbed Wire, and the chapters we're going to look at are called The Ascent and On Corruption, question mark. Now the discussion of the soul and the barbed wire is presaged earlier in the book, at the end of book one. At the very end of book one. For those with my edition or who have the photocopy, this is 483. No one would have this. I'm sorry if the photocopies wouldn't cover this. But this is on page 143 to 145 in Peterson. And in it, and I'm going to read from page 484, which is 144 in Peterson. This is Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn writes this. He's been arrested, interrogated, sentenced, and now he's getting ready to be shipped, is where we are. And he says this is on page 484. But our peevish qualifications somehow interrupt our line of thought. The plan of our chapter creaks and cracks, and we no longer know the answer to the question. Here's the question. Is the soul of a person in the new type of prison, in the special purpose prison, purified? Or does it perish once and for all? If the first thing you see each and every morning is the eyes of your cellmate who has gone insane, how then shall you save yourself during the coming day? Nikolai Androzevich Kozhnizhin, whose brilliant career in astronomy was interrupted by his arrest, saved himself only by thinking of the eternal and infinite, of the order of the universe, and of the supreme spirit of the stars, of their internal state, and what time and the passing of time really are. So he was in that situation. Is the soul purified, or does it perish? In the last couple paragraphs of this chapter, he says, and now we shall begin the chapter on the conflict between the soul and the bars, right? But then he's interrupted, he's taken away on a train, and he goes to book 2, which is being on trains, and then he goes to the camps, which is book 3, and he returns to the soul and the bars in part 4, the soul and the barbed wire, okay? But the question he raises there at the end of book 1 is the same question of part 4. Does the soul perish in the camps? Or is it purified, or as he'll call it in book 4, does it ascend? So corruption, that's the perishing of the soul. That's chapter 2. Ascent, that's the purification of the soul. And I think that's chapter 1, the ascent. Is this making sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, now I want to, so he presents the big question, and then he hides the big question when he's in part 4. But he doesn't hide it that much. We'll get to that in a second. Okay, a little bit on each of these sections, and then I want to try to develop the themes of the sections. All right, I mentioned this last time, the little dividing lines that separate the chapters out aren't in the Peterson edition. So I just want to provide those for you. The Ascent has 4 parts, okay? The first part is for those with the Peterson edition, from 299 to 301, and then you should put a little star on that, and when there's a gap on page 301. That's on suicide. Okay, 301 to 305 is on what I'm calling the fork in the camp. Page 305 to 308 is on the results that count. And then 308 to 313 is, I would say, his stoical conversion. And that's to the end of it. Corruption has 2 parts. The first part is long. It goes from 618 to 628 in Peterson, and it's on the differences between camps and prisons. And then the last part is on correctional purpose of punishment, 628 to 631 to the end. All right, so those are the orienting things. The big question of these chapters is this: can the ideological project work? Can it succeed? Can it cause the soul to perish? Now, there are two characters in these chapters that think that the soul can perish. One is Stalin, all right, the builder of the Gulag, whose purpose, as we just read there at the end of part 1, is to build a new man, new kind of human being. And the other person who seems to believe in this cause is this strange thing that happens in the chapter on corruption. This is the first page, the first couple paragraphs of it, where Solzhenitsyn says, let's bring out this guy, Shalamov. Shalamov says that the camps totally corrupted the human beings. And he goes through the list of things that were eradicated from the human experience. There's a couple block quotations that Solzhenitsyn relays. All human emotions, love, friendship, this is on the first page of chapter 2 on corruption. Love, friendship, envy, love of one's fellows, mercy, thirst for fame, honesty, fell away from us along with the meat of our muscles. There's a couple block quotes, but just going to the last one that he says, Ascent, growth and profundity, the development of human beings is possible in prison, Shalamov says. But camp is wholly and consistently a negative school of life. There is nothing either necessary or useful that anyone derives from it. The prisoner learns flattery, falsehood, and petty and large-scale meanness. So this Shalamov character is a person who wrote a book. He's a former Zek. And he wrote a book that said, Stalin, he didn't mean to say this, but the implication of his argument was that Stalin is right. You can make a new human beings in camps. The gulags work. You can take away people's love of property, their love of friendship, and you can make a whole new moral universe where the things pre-camp are hated and the new vices or virtues of the camp are loved. And Solzhenitsyn continues to develop Shamalov's thought throughout of corruption. I'm just going to give you the highlights. What does camp life do to the Zeks? It makes them profoundly envious. When someone gets out of the camp, everyone else doesn't praise him or think he's lucky. They envy him. Everyone is gripped with fear. Everyone practices deceit with their fellows and with the guards. In fact, now this cunning is a kind of virtue. People learn to inform on their fellows in the camp. They're praised for that. People are even promoted, Zaks are even promoted to being guards. And those guards, Solzhenitsyn says, are the cruelest guards. But this is the new morality that Shalamov says is created through the camps. Stalin is right. Corruption can become the new normal, and a new man can arise in the camps. So you wonder why Solzhenitsyn brings up this guy? He's a depressed and defeated victim of Stalin, who in his defeat testifies to the success of Stalin's ideological project. Does that make sense to everyone? All right, so as I say, the big question of these chapters is, can the ideological project succeed? Can you transform human beings with 24/7, 365 days a year supervision, punishment that you get in the camps? That's their purpose. They're called re-education camps, right? And a re-education camp is supposed to produce a new man. Can it succeed? That's the big question, all right? And that's why he's talking about Shalamov and the Gulag. Now, it's probably a question you've asked yourself. New ideologies arise all the time. What's going to be the status of the old human, of the old world? The things that used to be of value are valued less. If you continue the trend lines, they'll be valued at 0. So if you live in an ideological age, you need to think through the question, can the ideological project succeed? There's no answer, like it hasn't succeeded yet, doesn't suffice as an answer, because it could if it's done with more passion and intelligence, or more comprehensive application of its principles, okay? All right, so we began talking about this last time, and I want to try to address this big question, can the ideological project work? First of all, what is an ideological project? We were getting to this point last time, and I want to try to provide a decent definition of this. First, an ideological project involves the desecration of the old. You could call it nihilistic revolution, but its purpose first must be to destroy what it's given. And to just go through the things that are destroyed in these chapters: family, property, tradition, friendship, a thirst for justice, a thirst for righteousness, jealousy, and other things that can be good things, are the things that are gone. These things need to be eradicated. And then the second aspect of an ideological project is inflating one good over all other goods and over the bads. I think it's like, for me, Solzhenitsyn's mantra is, the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man, not through nations, classes, races, or sexes. I add sexes just for the Me Too movement. We don't want to believe all women, because the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every human being, which means that sometimes people lie. So when you apply that principle to public policy, you might make a lot of changes. But regardless, I think that's Solzhenitsyn's fundamental principle. And what is an ideological revolution? He defines this for us on page 615 and 616 in my version, and 312 and 313 in the Peterson version. This is near the end of the Ascent, okay? And at the end of the Ascent, he mentions the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man, on page 615. It's the second time in the book he says it. It's how he came to know that thing, is what the Ascent is about. We'll get to that in a little bit. And then after stating that, he says at the bottom of 615 for me, probably the bottom of 312 for you guys, since then I have come to understand the truth of all religions of the world. They struggle with the evil inside a human being, inside every human being. It is impossible to expel evil from the world in its eternity, but it is possible to constrict it within each person. Then the key part for understanding what the ideological project is. Since that time, I have come to understand the falsehood of all revolutions in history. Now that's a statement. They destroy only those carriers of evil contemporary with them, and also fail out of, haste to discriminate the carriers of good as well. And they then take to themselves as their heritage the actual evil itself, magnified still more. Now, what I take him to be talking about here is something that in another context and in another book, C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis calls the abolition of man, right? And with the abolition of man, man is ultimately for Lewis abolished by what he calls conditioners, people who provide a new conditioning. And what the new conditioning is a part of the Tao, chapter 2 of The Abolition of Man, inflated out of all proportion to the denigration of the other goods of the Tao. The revolutions in history, insofar as those revolutions seek to eradicate evil from the world, end up participating in evil and eradicating goods as well. So I don't think he means all the revolutions in the world. I think he means all the ideological revolutions in the world in that particular context, because not every revolution turns the world upside down. Real ones seek to, at least. Okay, so the ideological project is, I'm saying, similar to what Lewis means by the abolition of man. We in good shape? Now, Lewis struggles with this near the end of the abolition of man. He says, well, could it succeed? Could the conditioners create a new man? And what Lewis says is, I don't even have any answer to that question, because there is no answer to that question. It actually is, in his view, an expression of faith to say that human nature is an unchanging thing that can't be revolutionized. I mean, there's a lot of evidence for that position, like all of human history is evidence for that position, right? Just like I would say most people are mortal. No, we would say all people are mortal, but we cannot tell you that Jackson's child will not be immortal. If it's a test to discover whether or not human beings are mortal, it's an experiment that goes on for the entire history of human beings. And it's just like a strong tendency toward mortality, though. Would you agree? And it seems like there's a strong tendency to the persistence of many goods and many evils in human nature. But maybe, just maybe, Marx is right. And there'll be a revolution, there'll be a new man, and we'll all be drinking that free bubble up and eating that rainbow stew. Or to put that differently, Chernyshevsky's world of what is to be done could come about. Okay, so that's the big question. Now, how does Solzhenitsyn begin to answer this question? First of all, he goes after Shalamov, all right? And he does that, obviously, in the chapter on corruption. And he tries to show, and I think pretty convincingly shows, that at least Shalamov is an old man and does not adhere. He's been through the camps, but he came through with something intact. Go to that first page on corruption or corruption. After he talks about love, friendship, envy, love of one's fellows, all of those things being removed from the human experience, he closes with this: the only thing left was anger, the most enduring of human emotions. Now it's interesting. Anger. Why does anger persist? The old idea of anger is that anger arises when you have been done an injustice. Now, we're not always good at figuring out that we have been done an injustice. You guys have been cut off when driving and introduced people to fingers that you shouldn't do that to, right? We've all been angry like that. And sometimes we're even at fault and we're still angry at the other person, right? It's not discriminating as an emotion, but it does show that the love of justice persists even through the camps. Go back to the beginning of the Ascent, that first section that I talked about on suicide. Solzhenitsyn is not surprised that there are very few suicides in these camps. These people should despair, but they don't. Why? He says at the last part of that section that it's a universal sense of their innocence keeps them from killing themselves. Anger at the injustice that has been done to these people keeps them alive. And that is an attachment to, I'm going to say, the old moral universe that Stalin needs to eradicate if his project is going to be successful. People have to lose their thirst for righteousness and their love of justice. But these Zeks, it hasn't happened. Now, maybe it could. It could happen, but strong evidence suggests that it won't. Another thing about Shalamov, on page 623, I'm sorry I don't have this marked, but it's not. It's something that'll be very easy to check out. He says, Shalamov says, everyone imprisoned in camp was spiritually impoverished. But whenever I recall or encounter a former Zek, I find a real personality. Elsewhere, Shalamov himself writes that he wouldn't betray other Zeks. He wouldn't become a brigadier or compel others to work. Well, doesn't that show that he values friendship or hates tyranny and won't participate in the tyranny? So even this guy who says that human beings have their souls ripped out and there is no virtue in the camps, himself manifests the virtues or the emotions that are connected with virtues. Right? It just suggests that this is no easy thing to do that Stalin has set for himself. It is not easy to make a new man. Now, what distinguishes the people who are not corrupted? Is it something enduring that distinguishes the people who are not corrupted? All right, that's the next part of how I want to address this big question. Once again, I think the chapter, or corruption, is the place to look for this. I'm sorry to disappoint. The Ascent is the famous chapter, but the corruption is the one that's on the ideology. Now, on page 626, I'm sorry, this is near the end of that first section, but not the first end of it. After giving example after example of people who resisted corruption, Solzhenitsyn writes this is the first paragraph on 626. If whoever finds this in the Peterson, let me know. It begins with the words, so wouldn't it be more correct? Is how it starts. Anyone there?
Page 319.
319, good. So wouldn't it be more correct to say that no camp can corrupt those who have, here's the phrase I'm going to return to, a stable nucleus, who do not accept that pitiful ideology which holds that human beings are created for happiness, an ideology which is done in by the first blow of the work assigner's cudgel. So who has a stable nucleus? I think another way of putting the same thought, to use contemporary lingo, is who is based? Right? Who has a tangible nucleus? Now, that's a big question. It seems that there are three groups of people that have tangible nucleuses. Or do I say nuclei? I do say nuclei, don't I? So that's weird. There are three groups of people. The Christians, the philosophers, and I'm going to call them the stoical converts. The Christians come to the camps with a tangible nucleus. And Solzhenitsyn, throughout both last week and this week, notices that the people who are most willing to say no to the guards, to accept general work, the people who are not willing to be stoolies, the people who are not willing to be trustees, are often Christians of all different kinds of sects. Russians, Catholics, Baptists, he even mentions, I think, in last week's reading. So the Christians, rely on faith and God. But it does require that many of them, at least, come to the Gulag with that background. The Christians are not corrupt before the Gulag, and the Gulag does not corrupt them. There's another group, I'm calling them the philosophers. For this we have to go back to the Ascent. This is page 605. This is in part 2 of the Ascent. He tells a story of a group of intellectuals who are on death's door, but nevertheless give each other their last lectures. And they're relying on the importance of their ideas to prevent corruption. But then the other kind of person with a stable nucleus are the people who grow in the camps. Okay? People who grow in the camps. And for that, Solzhenitsyn is the model. Right? He is the model person who grows in the camps. Let's just trace that a little bit, okay? So at the beginning of part 2 of the Ascent, right after he talks about suicide, this is on page 602 for those with my edition, and I can't tell you what it would be for the Peterson edition, but it's right close to the beginning. Solzhenitsyn retells the story of the whole book in a page. The whole book, like everything before where we are now, the first volume, part 1, part 2, part 3. But here's what he says about himself when he arrived there. Now, would you guys agree, we read a little bit about this last time, was Solzhenitsyn corrupt when he came to the camp?
No.
And the way he describes himself quite a bit in that first part is he was pretty corrupt. Now, he did say no to the secret police. He didn't become a blue cap. There was something in him that found them repulsive that he couldn't articulate. But, he's a very much a but for the grace of God go I kind of guy when it comes to the KGB. It could have been him, right? Because he had so many of the attributes. If they would have just pressed different buttons, they could have gotten him. And so maybe Solzhenitsyn comes to the camp corrupt. There's something else in him, but there is something profoundly corrupt in him. And he kind of goes into that right here at the beginning of this section on 602. He says this. He talks about the prison sky. It was dark. We all, except religious believers, began from one point. We tried to tear our hair from our head, but our hair had been clipped close. How could we? How could we not have seen those who informed against us? And he goes on, right? It's an injustice that's been done him. And he can't get over that injustice. And then he starts going around transit prisons, next paragraph. And then he goes to camps. And he says, the duty that you have when you arrive in a camp is to survive at any price. And that's right at the bottom of 602 for me. At any price? That's the question. The question is, can he survive at any price? The truly corrupt human being would survive at any price. And he puts numbers on it. You guys agree with that? He puts numbers on it when he talks about the Zeks. 5% become socially friendly thieves. Right? 5% spend their time, are there because they've stolen state property. I think that's what he says. So they're thieves of some sort. Maybe not as corrupt as the other group, but probably are. 85%, do the math, 85%, he guesses, become corrupt. And it never talks about the last 5%, right? Because on my reckoning, that's 95. Mm-hmm. He never talks about the other 5%. And except I think he thinks that those are what I'm calling the stoical converts, the Christians and the philosophers who were in the camp. So the Ascent is a small group of people within the camp. Even by Solzhenitsyn's own reckoning, it's a small group of people. How do you become a stoical convert? Once again, you come in, you're not thinking about it, you don't have a stable nucleus, but then you face the fork of camp life, top of 603. All right, the fork of camp life, here's what he has to say about it. This is the fork of camp life. From this point, the roads go to the right and to the left. One of them will rise and the other one will descend. If you go to the right, you lose your life. If you go to the left, you lose your conscience. So, do you try to avoid general work? The hardest work in the camp. If the goal is to survive at any price, you seek to avoid general work. Do you become an informer? Or he calls it a stool pigeon, right, in here. Do you become a stool pigeon? If the goal is to survive at any price, the answer is you become a stool pigeon. You aim for you aim to become a guard of the other sex. You aim to become a work assigner because you can make your load lighter while, of course, making someone else's load heavier. Become a guard. You get a soldier's ration, he says. That's great. And it also means you're going to shoot the other sex. There is no way to survive at any price that doesn't involve harming someone else. And that's what he means by losing your conscience. Now, I've been thinking about this just because life is what it is. And is it easy to follow the conscience in prison, in the camps? Now, it's not easy, but let me put the question differently. Where is it easier to follow your conscience? The camps or on the outside? Strangely, the answer is in the camps. When you're on the outside, you have a lot to lose, right? You have a lot to lose. He talks about this at the beginning of part 3 when he's going through the advantages of living in the Gulag. Because, I mean, that's kind of an amazing thing. The first thing he says, I think we can all sympathize, is no meetings. I mean, like, I'm ready to be signed up for the Gulag if it can deliver me no meetings. No committee meetings, no one tries to give you membership squeezes, nothing like that. But then he says there's one more freedom. This is the 4th paragraph, maybe 5th paragraph of that section 3 of the Ascent. And there is one more freedom. No one can deprive you of your family and property. You have already been deprived of them. What does not exist, not even God can take away. And that is basic freedom. So he's not worried. You're not worried about losing your job in the Gulag. You're not worried about being canceled in the Gulag. You're not worried about losing customers in the Gulag. You're not worried about your children being tainted by your execrable name in the Gulag. You're already nothing. What do you have to lose? Like, you're going to sell out your fellow Zaks for an extra piece of bread or a little vodka? It's pitiful. And 95% still don't do it. Okay, so I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself, but I was not going to talk about that. But I couldn't miss the meeting line personally. That's the nicest thing about. Well, I can't say that. I'll say that later. Okay, we're talking about Solzhenitsyn's conversion. All right. So you have the fork. Everyone faces the fork. And it looks to me like the story of Solzhenitsyn's conversion is observing other people follow conscience and not ease. And then reflecting on what precisely that would mean. Right? Reflecting on precisely what that would mean. And eventually recognizing the foolish temptations that the life of ease presents. Okay, let's go through that a little bit. For me, this is part 3, where we just were reading about the meetings and so on. Solzhenitsyn has these wonderful paragraphs on corruption. Okay? Now, all right, so let's go back to the big picture. Can the ideological project work? That is our big question. The working out of the ideological project would seem to depend on the status of the stable nucleus. If the nucleus is genuinely stable, then there's a limit to what the ideological project can accomplish. If the nucleus is not stable, then the ideological project is more likely to succeed. We've seen that the stability of that nucleus is attached to religion, to philosophy, and then to this analysis of the human condition that Solzhenitsyn is beginning to talk about, okay? Now, let's go back up to the top here. The way the ideological project works its way into the Gulag is to try to convince the Zaks that they should not follow their conscience and they should take the left fork toward the life of ease. They should survive at any cost. This is what they are taught. Movies are brought in. And this is how Solzhenitsyn begins what I'm talking about. Movies are brought in, the lesson of which is to survive at any cost. The results are what count. And what's the result you're after? The result you're after is survival to the end of the term. And then things are going to be great. All right. It's the results that count. Now, Solzhenitsyn says that idea, it's the results that count, was the Russian culture. It was corrupt before the Soviets took it over. Right? The results are what count. All right, so he actually goes through this. All right, so what am I talking about here? The corruption in the Gulag mirrors the corruption of this society. The people who came in corrupt, their corruption was exposed. The people who came in with a stable nucleus, their stable nucleus was tested, but they shone through and ascended. All right, and he says the Russian/Soviet culture were taken with this idea that the results are what counts. All right, I want to go through this argument here, okay? So after saying it's the result that counts during that movie review on the top of 608 in mine, and what page is that in the Peterson? Anyone there? It's the result is what counts, and the result is not in your favor. That's where we are. Okay? Everyone was laughing when this played on the screen. Go to the next paragraph. This was no joke, Solzhenitsyn said. This was an infectious thought. It has long since been inculcated in our fatherland. And they keep on inculcating it over and over. The concept is that only the material result counts. And it's become so much a part of us that when, for example, and he goes on to give other, he says, when communists get convicted by Stalin, the people say, well, what more could they have wanted? Why did they upset Uncle Joe? They had, and he goes on, he makes a list, 20 suits, 2 country homes, and a car. Why couldn't they have been satisfied with that? It's the results that count. All right, let me just back up for a second. The fatherland shows that this isn't simply about the Bolsheviks. Right? And then he gives more examples. Let's go into these examples. In the first place, whence did this come to us? He says, now, can we agree, it's the results that count? Can you think of a prominent American politician who would agree? Who will make a deal? Who loves winners? Right now, I'm not really saying that he's an emblem, but it's a thing, right? It's a result, or can you, and just to be bipartisan, by any means necessary, as a slogan, it's the results that count. Is another way of saying the same thing, right? All right, in the first, where did this come from? Whence did this come to us? His first example is when Russia built an empire. They committed injustices against Ukrainians and Belarusians and Kazakhs and all the others, and they built an empire. A fatherland became well established then. He ends the paragraph. The result is what counts. And then after that, he talks about the establishment of secret police, spies, which he has shown in this book beforehand. The Tsar's spies were like midgets compared to the Gulliver of Stalin's spies. But nevertheless, they did establish the spies. It's the result that counts. And then, just to let you know that the knife goes into the Bolsheviks more than the Tsar, he says, and then from all kinds of socialists, and most of all from the most modern, infallible, and intolerant teaching, capital T, which consists of this one thing only. The result is what counts. It is important to forge a fighting party, and to seize power, and to hold on to power, and to remove all enemies, and to conquer in pig iron and steel, and to launch rockets. It's like the Stalinist program. Right? And though for this industry and for these rockets, it was necessary to sacrifice a way of life, and the integrity of the family, and the spiritual health of the people, and the very soul of our fields and forests and rivers, and to hell with them, the result is what counts. So this idea has been around. It's the successful conquering of nature. That's the result that is being sought. And when that is the goal, to hell with everything in the way, we're going to conquer. That's the result we're after. Now, as I say, the Tsar was a pygmy compared to Stalin when it comes to this stuff, but he was not innocent. Okay? And every time a line is crossed in a republic, it's always excused because it's the result that counts. Those lines cannot be reimposed, or can only be reimposed with difficulty. Let me say it like that so I can defend Lincoln later on from arguments that will be made against him. It's the result that counts. Now apply that to the camp. That's what he then goes on to do, right? If it's the result that counts, you become a stool pigeon. If it's the result that counts, you avoid general work. Right? That's what it means in the Gulag. Avoid every kind of work. And then, I think, one of the key lines in the Ascent. But there will come a day, or there will come a Zach, who will say to himself, I'm going to do general work. And when you do general work, this is the bottom of 609 for those with my book. It's the last few paragraphs of that section, section 3. Your hands will be torn to tatters. Your skin will be nothing. You'll be starving. You'll have no bread. Now I'm at the end of this. And this is when you have ceased to be afraid of threats and are not chasing after rewards, you become the most dangerous character in the owl-like view of the bosses. Because what hold do they have on you? Okay. Now, so we go from a tangible nucleus. So Solzhenitsyn has built, I'm going to call it, a stable nucleus in the camps. That's his achievement. That's his ascent. He has built a stable nucleus in the camps. And what is he going to do with this stable nucleus? What does it mean? Now, there's a lot of stories that are told of the people who are in the camps and what good things that they do. They refuse to send people out. They refuse to shoot at people. They help those who are in need. They do many small-scale kindnesses. They learn to forgive. They learn patience. They become what I'm calling stoical. They recognize all of the harms that are going on around them. They accept those harms and try to find happiness and good character by doing their duty in their place where they are. Okay? Now that's not a dangerous guy. Right? And all right, so let's just say two more things. What will be done? What will these most dangerous men do? This is another thing that's discussed or corruption, and let's turn to that quickly. This is on 627. They are capable of, this is right after he talks about the stable nucleus. They are capable of friendship. And then at the bottom of 627, in the next part, I hope to show how in other camps, in special camps, this is part 5, in part 5, not the next chapter, but in the next part, a different environment was created after a certain time. The process of corruption was greatly hampered, and the process of ascent became attractive even to the camp careerists. So there was some movement that he's going to chart in part 5, Karatoga, that even some of those who were corrupt ascended. And that is going to be a kind of political movement. So let me just put a fine point on something. When I say that Solzhenitsyn looks to be a stoic convert, what I mean by that is his ascent doesn't give rise to action. It gives rise to a proper psychological reaction to the pain and injustice around him. That he learns to take it. But he doesn't learn to do anything. And just learning to take it, well, if that's all you do, the Gulag can win. So politics is necessary in order to preserve human nature, the conscience, in order to stop the ideological project from winning. You can't just rely on resigned patience. And that's, as I say, what he talks about in part 5, which I think is what we're talking about the 4th class. The next week we're going to talk about how Soviet society. No, I should put that differently. What kind of society tolerates the Gulag? And that's the chapter, Our Muzzled Freedom. I'll send out an article I've written on this recently, America's Muzzled Freedom, which clickbait for the bubbas. And so, are there any questions?
So this new kind of citizen that the ideology is creating is basically just someone who obeys, right? Because someone who has a nucleus that is solid is someone who can resist that, which means that they don't obey. Because it seems like this type of person that Solzhenitsyn is talking about that is being created is kind of like a scummy person, like somebody who betrays and they do all those things, but they're obeying. Is that the type of person that's being created?
All right, so let's make a distinction. The new kind of person outside the camp and the new kind of person inside the camp. All right, the new kind of person outside the camp will have no other attachment other than what the party demands. The party will be what he loves. The story that I would relay that Solzhenitsyn talks about at some points in the book is a story of this young boy idol, like the Justin Bieber of the Bolsheviks. His name is Morozov, and he informs on his parents, and they're hoarding, and his father is like, he's not attached to his parents or the family. He doesn't obey them. He listens to his teachers who are getting their orders from the state, from the party, and adheres to what is demanded and what the public good is, betrays his father, if you want to think of it like that, or you could also think of it as informs on his father because he committed injustice, and the father's executed. And there are operas done for this kid under Stalin. He's one of the great celebrated folk heroes that Stalin sought to create. And then he was killed by his family, the boy, according to the legend. So a great injustice was done, and this hero was murdered by this retrograde group. So it's an idea of what the new man needs to be. Okay, where the Zeks fit in is that they need to become flat human beings that are accomplishing the work that the party and the system have set for it. That's their goal. And anything that would get in the way of them performing that necessary function needs to be eradicated. And that is the attachment to family and conscience and all, right? So they try to create an incentive system and a structure so that the Zeks are always suspicious of one another, so they could never rise up. And it's interesting, there were very few Zek uprisings until late in the ballgame. We'll talk about this in the fourth class, but it's only after Stalin introduced a 25-year term that you really started to get camp revolts. When he just hanged tenors on people, they're like, well, I can maybe handle it for 10 years. But when they started to put 25-year terms on them, people are like, I might as well revolt. and because that, like 25 years, that sounds like life, right? And it probably is life under these circumstances. So does that get at what you're getting at?
Yeah, so the people outside of the camps, they're just required to love what the party dictates or tells them to love.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what in this, to love?
Production for the sake of building the party and sustaining it against its enemies, foreign and domestic.
But you could also say that those people outside of the camp had stable nucleuses. And how do you accomplish the goal without completely eliminating all of the stable nucleuses?
Yeah, and that's why you have to create new heroes who betray their parents. I mean, like, that would be a thing, right? I mean, I could see it happening. Like, there was a time once in my family where I denied global warming at dinner. And like, that's a crime, right? That, like, it would be better if people never thought like that. And so it requires a new kind of more new heroes. And the Soviet Union was filled with them, right? You can see it in progressive architecture for us. And the Soviets had great versions of that stuff. Go ahead, Peter.
But a lot of people in the Soviet Union at the time obeyed. They didn't love.
Yeah.
My family in Ukraine. And
Yeah.
kid having cousins who had gone to the Ukraine, came back and described how their cousins who lived in the Ukraine in the early 60s were living. And they were in fear
Yeah.
at all times. You had to obey. And at the time I didn't understand it was because, now I know, they were afraid of going to the Gulag.
Yeah, so there's a real argument to be made that Stalin's methods were clumsy, that the Gulag doesn't work as well as other methods could. And that, in a way, is like Aldous Huxley's point, and why A Brave New World was such a popular book. Like, we can do this differently and better, more humanely, we can get everyone to love it. Whereas no one could believe that 1984 would happen. I mean, that was way more totalitarian and obvious, and so Stalin's error in that case would be that he tried to get the soul, but he aimed at the body. And it's much better, and this is what Huxley's point is, I think, to go for the soul and form it and kind of leave the body aside. Give people all the food and pleasures that they want, and you might be able to make them into something new. And this is, anyways, I think that what you say is true. He may have been clumsy, but Solzhenitsyn is analyzing the ideological ambition, not the clumsiness in a way. Like, Stalin is easier to find horrible than Jack Kevorkian. I'm trying to think of who my other example would be, like a geneticist who wants to make a new man, or those who are promoting AI. And so forth. Maybe that would lead to a new man. I mean, they're just trying to help us. That's a much more effective way of accomplishing what Stalin sought to do. So we've made a lot of advances in tyranny.